Sometimes the people closest to us hurt us the most, not with their words, but with their doubt. When Jack Landry inherited his father's old hangar, his family called it worthless before he'd even seen it. The widowed mechanic stood in the lawyer's office, holding rusted keys that felt heavier than they should. His father, Samuel, had been dead 3 months, and this forgotten airfield hangar was all he'd left behind. Jack's sister, Margaret, rolled her eyes. His brother-in-law called it junk. Even his teenage son, Wyatt, shook his head in disappointment. Jack was broke, unemployed, and running out of hope. But something about those keys felt important, like his father's final message to a son who'd never really known him. What Jack would find inside that locked hangar would change everything he thought he knew about failure, family, and the father who'd kept the biggest secret of his life. But would he choose money or honor a legacy he'd never understood? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Landry sat in his pickup truck outside the law office, staring at the brass keys in his palm. They were old, heavy things, darkened with age and neglect. The kind of keys that belonged to something important, though he couldn't imagine what his father might have considered worth locking away. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke, reminding him of better times when his late wife Sarah would make coffee before dawn, and they'd sit on the porch planning their day. Those mornings felt like a lifetime ago now. Sarah had been gone 2 years, the cancer taking her just when Wyatt needed his mother most. Jack had lost his job at Morrison's auto shop 6 months later, when the owner's son returned from college with new ideas about efficiency and payroll cuts. At 52, Jack found himself in a place he'd never expected, broke, unemployed, and watching his relationship with his 16-year-old son crumble like everything else in his life. Wyatt had grown distant since Sarah's death, spending most of his time locked in his room or hanging around friends whose parents still had steady incomes and functioning families. The lawyer, a thin man named Peterson with wire-rimmed glasses, had been polite but clearly eager to close Samuel Landry's estate. "Your father was very specific about this property," Peterson had said, sliding the keys across his mahogany desk. "He wanted you to have it, though I have to say, Mr. Landry, the land isn't worth much. It's an old airfield about 40 miles outside town, been abandoned since the 70s. Jack had nodded, unsurprised. His father had never been one for valuable gifts or grand gestures. Samuel Landry had been a quiet man who fixed things for a living: radios, engines, anything mechanical that people brought to his cluttered workshop behind the house. He'd served in the military during the Cold War, though he'd never talked about it. Jack's childhood memories of his father were filled with the sound of tools on metal and the smell of machine oil, punctuated by long silences that felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. "There are some back taxes owed," Peterson had continued, shuffling through papers. "Nothing excessive, but you'll need to settle them if you want to keep the property." More debt. Jack had almost laughed. It seemed fitting that even his father's final gift would come with strings attached and obligations he couldn't afford. But something about the keys had made him pause. They weren't ordinary keys. They were substantial, military style, with numbers etched into the metal. The kind of keys that suggested whatever they opened was built to last and meant to stay closed. Now, sitting in his truck with the engine running, Jack studied the faded military photograph he'd found tucked inside the envelope with the keys. It showed his father as a young man in uniform, standing next to what looked like aircraft, though the background was too blurred to make out details. Samuel looked serious, professional, nothing like the tired man who'd raised Jack with quiet disappointment and few words. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, his older sister. "Don't waste money on Dad's junk. Just sell the land and be done with it." Margaret had always been practical to a fault. She'd married well, lived in a nice suburb, and had opinions about Jack's choices that she shared freely. She'd been the one to suggest Jack was too emotional about their father's death, as if grief had an expiration date that Jack had somehow exceeded. But it wasn't grief that made Jack pocket the keys and start his truck. It was something LC nagging sense that he'd never really known his father at all, and this might be his last chance to understand the man who'd shaped his life through absence as much as presence. The drive to the airfield took him through countryside he'd forgotten existed, past farms and forests that reminded him of hunting trips with his father when he was young. Those had been some of their best times, together quiet hours in the woods, where Samuel's silence felt comfortable instead of judgmental, where Jack could almost pretend they understood each other. The airfield appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, a collection of weathered buildings and cracked runways that spoke of decades of neglect. The hangar dominated the landscape, massive curved structure of corrugated metal that had once been silver but now showed patches of rust like battle scars. It was bigger than Jack had expected, easily large enough to house commercial aircraft. He parked near the hangar doors and stepped out into wind that carried the scent of old metal and distant rain. The property felt abandoned, but not quite empty, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and small trees had taken root in places where drainage had failed, but the basic infrastructure looked solid. The hangar doors were secured with a chain and multiple locks, including one that matched the military-style key in Jack's hand. As he approached, he noticed details that suggested this place had once been much more sophisticated than a simple storage facility. The doors themselves were reinforced, designed to withstand more than weather. Warning signs, faded but still readable, indicated restricted access and government property. His father had owned government property? That didn't make sense. Jack tried the first key, then the second. The third one turned with a solid click that echoed in the quiet air. The chain fell away with a metallic rattle that seemed too loud in the stillness. The hangar doors were heavy, requiring significant effort to slide open even a few feet. The gap revealed darkness so complete that Jack's eyes needed time to adjust. When they did, he saw a space so vast it seemed to swallow the afternoon light streaming through the opening. The air inside was cool and dry, carrying scents of metal polish and something else he couldn't identify, something that reminded him of his father's workshop, but more refined, more purposeful. As his eyes adapted further, he began to make out shapes in the darkness. Large objects covered by tarps, workbenches along the walls, and equipment he couldn't immediately identify. His footsteps echoed as he walked deeper into the space, each step revealing more of the hangar's unexpected sophistication. This wasn't a storage facility or an abandoned building. This was a workspace, carefully maintained and deliberately preserved. On one of the workbenches, Jack found a flashlight that still worked, its beam revealing the true scope of what his father had left him. The hangar stretched much further than he'd realized, and the covered objects were enormous, much larger than cars or trucks. As the beam swept across the space, it caught something that made Jack's breath catch. The edge of a tarp had pulled away from one of the large objects, revealing a glimpse of sleek metal that gleamed despite decades of storage. Whatever was under those covers, it had been maintained with the kind of care his father had always shown, his most precious tools. Jack's phone rang, Wyatt's name appearing on the screen. "Dad, where are you? You were supposed to pick me up an hour ago." Jack had forgotten completely. "I'm sorry, son. I'm at your grandfather's property. The airfield." "The what, Dad? You're not seriously dealing with Grandpa's junk, are you? Mom always said he was a pack rat." Sarah had said that, though always with affection. She'd understood Samuel better than anyone, somehow seeing past his silence to something worth patience and kindness. "It's not junk," Jack said, though he wasn't sure why he felt so certain. "I think your grandfather was involved in something important, something he never told us about." A pause. Then Wyatt's voice, cautious but curious. "What kind of important?" Jack looked around the hangar, at the covered shapes and sophisticated equipment, at the evidence of secrets his father had kept for decades. "I don't know yet, but I think we're going to find out." Jack returned to the hangar 3 days later with Wyatt, a cooler of sandwiches, and enough curiosity to override his usual caution. His son had surprised him by asking to come along, though Wyatt spent most of the drive staring out the window with the practiced indifference of a teenager who'd learned not to expect much from his father's projects. "This better not be like when you tried to restore that motorcycle," Wyatt said as they pulled up to the hangar. "We spent 2 months on that thing and it never ran." Jack winced at the memory. The motorcycle had been another attempt to connect with his son, another project that had ended in frustration and disappointment. But this felt different. The hangar held secrets that had been deliberately preserved, not abandoned. The massive doors proved even more challenging to open fully. It took both of them pulling together to slide them back far enough to let in substantial daylight. When they finally succeeded, the revealed space took Wyatt's breath away. "Dad, this place is huge. What did Grandpa need all this room for?" The hangar stretched nearly 200 feet in length and at least 100 feet wide, with a curved roof that rose to 40 feet at its peak. The structure was clearly military-grade, built to specifications that far exceeded anything needed for civilian aircraft storage. The concrete floor was smooth and level, marked with painted lines and symbols that suggested organized, purposeful use. But it was the locks that captured Jack's attention. The original hangar door lock was a complex mechanism, unlike anything he'd seen: multiple cylinders, reinforced housing, and what appeared to be a combination system integrated with the key locks. This wasn't hardware meant to keep out casual trespassers. This was security designed to protect something valuable. "Look at this," Jack said, running his fingers over the lock mechanism. "This is military-grade security. Your grandfather wasn't just storing farm equipment in here." Wyatt's skepticism began to crack as they explored deeper into the space. Work lights strung along the walls still functioned, revealing a level of organization and preservation that spoke of careful maintenance over many years. Tool racks lined the walls, filled with precision instruments. Workbenches bore the marks of regular use, but were spotlessly clean. And everywhere, the covered shapes loomed like sleeping giants. The largest objects were positioned in the center of the hangar, 2 massive forms beneath heavy canvas tarps that had been secured with military precision. Smaller covered items filled the remaining space equipment, machinery, and storage containers that suggested this had been an active workshop rather than simple storage. Jack approached the nearest large tarp with growing excitement and apprehension. The covering was held down by dozens of tie-downs and seemed to have been arranged to protect whatever lay beneath from decades of dust and moisture. As he began to unfasten the corners, Wyatt moved to help him. "Careful," Jack said. "We don't know how delicate this might be." They worked slowly, methodically, peeling back the heavy canvas to reveal glimpses of what lay beneath. The first thing Jack saw was metal knot, the rough, painted surface of farm equipment or automobiles, but smooth, precisely engineered aluminum that gleamed despite the years of storage. As more of the tarp came away, shapes began to emerge that made no sense for a civilian aircraft. The nose was sleek, almost predatory, with air intakes positioned in ways that suggested speed and sophisticated aerodynamics. This wasn't a crop duster or small passenger plane. This was something designed for performance. "Dad," Wyatt whispered, "what is that?" Jack couldn't answer, because he didn't know. The aircraft, and it was clearly an aircraft, was like nothing he'd ever seen in person. It resembled military jets he'd glimpsed in magazines or documentaries, but the design was somehow both familiar and completely foreign. The proportions were elegant, purposeful, suggesting engineering that prioritized function over appearance while achieving something beautiful in the process. They continued uncovering until the entire nose section was visible. Stenciled numbers on the fuselage read XJ-47A, Nighthawk 1, followed by smaller text that included NATO and a series of classification codes that meant nothing to Jack, but everything to his growing sense that they'd stumbled into something significant. The cockpit canopy was intact, providing a view into an interior that looked far more sophisticated than anything Jack had expected. The instrument panel was complex, filled with gauges and switches that suggested capabilities beyond simple flight. This aircraft had been designed for missions that required precision, stealth, and advanced technology. "We need to stop," Jack said suddenly, stepping back from the partially uncovered aircraft. "We need to think about this." "What do you mean, stop?" "Dad, this is incredible. Grandpa had a military jet hidden in here. Do you know what this means?" Jack knew exactly what it meant, and that was the problem. Military aircraft weren't the kind of thing civilians owned legally. If Samuel had this jet, there was a story behind it, probably a complicated story that involved governments and regulations and questions Jack wasn't prepared to answer. But as he looked at his son's face, bright with genuine excitement for the first time in months, Jack realized he couldn't walk away. Wyatt was already pulling out his phone, taking pictures, asking questions about specifications and history. The sullen teenager had been replaced by a young man engaged with something that mattered. "Let's cover it back up for now," Jack said, "but we'll come back tomorrow with better lights and more time." They spent the next hour carefully replacing the tarp and securing it properly. As they worked, Jack's mind raced with possibilities and concerns. The lock mechanism suddenly made sense. If Samuel had been hiding military aircraft, he would have needed security that could withstand decades of curiosity and investigation. But how had his father come to possess something like this? Samuel had been an electronics technician in the Air Force, not a pilot or officer. He'd served during the Cold War, but had never spoken about classified work or special assignments. After his discharge, he'd worked as a civilian contractor for a few years before settling into the quiet life of a small-town repairman. Or so Jack had always believed. On the drive home, Wyatt peppered him with questions. "Do you think there are more aircraft in there? What's under the other tarps? Why would Grandpa hide something like this? Is it legal for us to have it?" Jack didn't have answers, but he promised they'd find out together. For the first time since Sarah's death, he had something that connected him with his Sona mystery that belonged to both of them, inherited from a man who'd apparently kept the most important parts of his life hidden from everyone. That evening, Jack sat in his small kitchen with a cup of coffee and his father's few personal papers, looking for clues he'd missed during the initial sorting after the funeral. Most of it was mundane insurance policies, utility bills, receipts for equipment purchases. But tucked between pages of a repair manual, he found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a letter, typed on official letterhead but with the organization's name carefully blacked out. The visible text was fragmentary. "Project Nighthawk assets remain under your custodial care pending final resolution. Understood that disclosure without authorization. Grateful for your continued discretion regarding the humanitarian applications." The letter was dated 15 years ago and signed with an illegible signature above a title that had also been redacted. Jack read it 3 times before the implications began to sink in. His father hadn't stolen military property or stumbled across abandoned equipment. He'd been entrusted with something, assigned to protect it, given a responsibility that had lasted decades beyond his official service. But why keep it secret from his family? Why die without explaining what he'd been guarding or why it mattered? The questions followed Jack into a restless sleep where he dreamed of his father working alone in the vast hangar, maintaining aircraft that couldn't officially exist, carrying secrets that had isolated him from the son who'd never understood his silence. When he woke before dawn, Jack knew 2 things with absolute certainty. He was going back to the hangar, and this time he was going to uncover everything his father had hidden. The keys felt different in his hand, now not like a burden or disappointment, but like a key to understanding the man who'd raised him with such careful distance. Samuel Landry had been protecting something important enough to sacrifice his relationship with his family. Jack intended to find out what that something was, and why his father had trusted him to inherit the responsibility. The workshop tools were what convinced Jack that his father had been far more than a simple repairman. Arranged with military precision along custom-built workbenches, they represented decades of accumulated expertise and significant investment. These weren't the basic hand tools of a small-town mechanic. They were precision instruments designed for aerospace engineering. Digital calipers, accurate to thousandths of an inch, sat beside torque wrenches calibrated for aircraft specifications. Specialized gauges for measuring hydraulic pressure and electrical continuity filled drawers, organized with the kind of systematic care that spoke of professional training. Most telling were the reference manuals, thick technical volumes covering advanced propulsion systems, avionics, and flight dynamics subjects, far beyond anything Samuel's official work history should have required. Jack ran his fingers over a set of micrometers that probably cost more than he'd made in a month at the auto shop. These tools had been used regularly and maintained perfectly, their surfaces showing the gentle wear patterns of skilled hands performing delicate work. Grandpa was basically a rocket scientist, Wyatt said, photographing a complex electrical testing device. Look at this stuff, Dad. This is NASA-level equipment. They'd been working steadily since early morning, clearing debris and cataloging the workshop area that occupied nearly a quarter of the hangar's space. Each discovery added another layer to the mystery of Samuel's hidden life. Blueprint tubes contained detailed schematics for aircraft systems. File cabinets held maintenance logs going back decades, written in Samuel's careful handwriting and documenting work on aircraft, designated only by project numbers and code names. The maintenance logs revealed a pattern of regular activity that had continued until just months before Samuel's death. Whatever was under those tarps, he'd been caring for it constantly, checking systems, replacing components, ensuring everything remained in perfect working condition. Look at this entry, Jack said, reading from a logbook dated 6 months earlier. Monthly hydraulic system check completed, no leaks detected, fuel system purged and sealed. Avionics powered up for systems check all green. He was keeping them flight ready, Wyatt realized. But why? If they're just for display or historical preservation, why maintain them like they might need to fly? That question had been nagging at Jack all morning. The level of care and expense involved in maintaining aircraft to operational standards was enormous. Samuel's modest income as a repair shop owner couldn't have supported this kind of operation without external funding or support. They found part of the answer in a locked filing cabinet that Jack opened with another key from his inheritance. Inside were contracts and correspondence with aerospace companies, government contractors, and military suppliers. Samuel hadn't just been maintaining the aircraft, been documenting their condition and capabilities for someone else, filing regular reports that spoke of ongoing evaluation and assessment. The most intriguing documents were purchase orders for replacement parts and specialized materials, all paid for by accounts that trace back to defense contractors with deliberately vague names. Someone had been funding Samuel's work, ensuring he had everything needed to keep the aircraft in perfect condition. "Dad, you need to see this," Wyatt called from across the workshop. He'd found a small office area tucked behind the main workbench, complete with a desk, filing system, and what appeared to be a communications center. A shortwave radio setup occupied most of one wall, with antennas and frequency guides that suggested regular contact with parties unknown. On the desk, arranged as if Samuel had just stepped away, were technical journals filled with notes and calculations. The handwriting was his father's, but the content was far beyond anything Jack had associated with the quiet man who'd fixed neighbors' appliances and avoided conversations about his past. The journals detailed modifications and improvements to aircraft systems, theoretical discussions of flight characteristics under various conditions, and speculations about applications for humanitarian missions. Samuel hadn't just been maintaining someone else's equipment, been actively engineering improvements and adaptations. "Listen to this," Jack said, reading from one of the journals. "Modified fuel system allows for extended range operations in remote areas where conventional supply chains are unavailable. Potential applications include disaster relief, medical evacuation, and supply delivery to isolated populations." "Humanitarian missions," Wyatt repeated. "So these aren't weapons." "Maybe not originally, but aircraft designed for getting into remote areas quickly and quietly could probably be adapted for other purposes too." The implications were starting to overwhelm Jack. His father hadn't just been hiding. Aircraft had been part of an ongoing program that involved advanced technology with both humanitarian and potentially military applications. The secrecy, the security, the decades of careful maintenance, all pointed to something much larger than a simple inheritance. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "Jack, I've been thinking about Dad's property. Maybe you should have someone look at it before you waste time cleaning it up. There might be environmental issues or structural problems." "It's fine, Margaret. Better than fine, actually." "What do you mean?" Jack looked around the sophisticated workshop, at his son photographing equipment worth more than most people's houses, at evidence of his father's hidden expertise and ongoing responsibilities. "I mean, Dad wasn't the simple repair shop owner we thought he was. This place is full of advanced equipment and technical materials. I think he was involved in some kind of government contract work." Silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Jack, you're not getting carried away with fantasies, are you? Dad fixed radios and lawnmowers. He wasn't some secret agent." But Jack was looking at precision measuring tools worth thousands of dollars, at technical manuals classified above his security clearance, at maintenance logs documenting work on aircraft that weren't supposed to exist. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "Margaret, I need you to trust me on this. Come out and see for yourself if you don't believe me. I'm not driving 40 miles to look at Dad's junk, Jack. Just sell whatever you can and move on." After she hung up, Jack realized that his family's dismissive attitude was probably exactly what Samuel had counted on. Who would look for military secrets in a small-town repairman's inherited property? Who would believe that the quiet man who'd fixed their appliances had been entrusted with aircraft worth millions of dollars? The perfect hiding place had been in plain sight all along, protected not by elaborate security systems, but by the assumption that Samuel Landry had never been important enough to guard anything significant. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the hangar floor, Jack and Wyatt secured the workshop area and prepared to leave. They'd learned enough for one day, discovered enough to know that tomorrow would bring even more revelations. "Dad," Wyatt said as they walked toward the truck, "what are we going to do about all this?" Jack looked back at the hangar, at the building that had transformed from burden to mystery to responsibility in less than a week. "We're going to find out what your grandfather was protecting, and then we're going to decide whether we're worthy of protecting it too." The classified document fragment changed everything. Jack found it wedged inside Samuel's main toolbox, burned around the edges as if someone had tried to destroy it but couldn't quite follow through. The NATO letterhead was unmistakable, and the partial text that remained legible made Jack's hands shake as he read it. "Classified. Project Nighthawk. Eyes only," appeared at the top, followed by fragments of text. "Prototype aircraft designated XJ-47A and XJ-47B to remain under custodial care of Technical Sergeant Samuel Landry, retired. Humanitarian mission parameters. Political sensitivity requires indefinite postponement of operational deployment. Assets to be maintained in ready condition, pending future authorization." The document was dated 37 years ago, just 2 years after Samuel's discharge from active duty. Whatever Project Nighthawk had been, his father had been trusted with its most sensitive assets for nearly 4 decades. Wyatt leaned over his shoulder, reading the fragments. "Dad, this is huge. Grandpa was guarding classified military aircraft for the government." "Former government," Jack corrected, though he wasn't sure the distinction mattered. "This project was supposedly cancelled, but they left the aircraft with him instead of destroying them. They spent the rest of that day researching Project Nighthawk online, but found almost nothing. A few references in declassified documents mentioned experimental aircraft programs from the 1980s, but details were either redacted or missing entirely. Aviation forums contained speculation about classified NATO projects, but no concrete information about aircraft matching the designations they'd found. The silence was telling. Projects that had been genuinely cancelled usually left paper trails, historical analyses, even conspiracy theories. Project Nighthawk had been erased so thoroughly that it barely existed in the public record. That evening, Jack called Dr. Elena Rodriguez, an aviation historian at the State University, whose name he'd found in Samuel's contact list. Her phone number had been written in his father's careful script on a piece of paper tucked inside one of the technical manuals. "Dr. Rodriguez, my name is Jack Landry. I think you knew my father, Samuel." A long pause. Then carefully, "Samuel passed away recently, didn't he? I was sorry to hear about that." "You knew him?" "We corresponded occasionally about historical aviation projects. He was very knowledgeable about Cold War-era aircraft development." "How can I help you?" Jack hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I've inherited some property from him, an old airfield with aircraft that I think might be historically significant. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand what I'm dealing with." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Landry, could you describe these aircraft?" "Twin-engine jets, about 40 feet long, with markings that mention Project Nighthawk and NATO classification codes." The silence that followed stretched so long that Jack wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Dr. Rodriguez spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Mr. Landry, I think we need to meet in person. Are you available tomorrow afternoon?" When she arrived at the hangar the next day, Dr. Rodriguez was a small, intense woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She examined the partially uncovered aircraft with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. "These are XJ-47 Nighthawks," she said finally. "I've spent 20 years researching this program. Most experts believe all prototypes were destroyed when the project was cancelled." "But they weren't," Wyatt said. "Obviously not." She walked around the aircraft, noting details and taking careful measurements. "Your grandfather was entrusted with preserving what may be the only surviving examples of one of the most advanced aircraft designs of the Cold War era." Jack felt a mix of pride and overwhelming responsibility. What were they designed for? Officially, rapid deployment of humanitarian aid to remote or hostile areas. The design prioritized speed, stealth, and the ability to operate from minimal infrastructure. They could deliver medical supplies, food, or personnel to disaster zones that conventional aircraft couldn't reach safely. And unofficially, Dr. Rodriguez met his eyes. The same capabilities that make an aircraft perfect for humanitarian missions also make it valuable for intelligence gathering, special operations, or covert supply runs. The project was cancelled because certain political leaders worried about how the aircraft might be used if they fell into the wrong hands. So they gave them to my father instead of destroying them. Your father was the project's chief maintenance engineer. He understood these aircraft better than anyone, and he had a security clearance that allowed him to be trusted with classified materials. When the political decision was made to cancel the program, someone high up chose preservation over destruction. The weight of inheritance suddenly felt much heavier. Jack wasn't just the owner of valuable aircraft, was the guardian of a piece of aviation history that powerful people had wanted to erase. "What's my legal position here?" he asked. "Can the government just take them back?" "That's complicated. The cancellation documents I've seen suggest the aircraft were transferred to civilian custodial care with specific conditions. But those conditions were classified, and I don't know what they entailed." Over the following week, Jack found himself dividing time between the hangar and increasingly anxious conversations with family members who'd learned about the discovery. Margaret had driven out to see the aircraft for herself and returned home shaken, suddenly understanding that her dismissive attitude might have been premature. "Jack, these things could be worth millions," she'd said. "You need lawyers, you need experts, you need to be very careful about who you trust." But Jack was beginning to realize that his father's trust had been the most valuable inheritance of all. Samuel had chosen his son as the next guardian of Project Nighthawk, betting that Jack would make the right decisions about aircraft that represented both technological achievement and moral complexity. The question was whether Jack was worthy of that trust and what the right decisions might actually mean. The military communications radio crackled to life at 3 in the morning, filling the silent hangar with coded transmissions that made Jack's blood run cold. He'd been staying overnight in the hangar more frequently, partly for security and partly because he felt closer to understanding his father in this space where Samuel had spent decades working in secret. The radio was an impressive piece of equipment, built into a console that suggested regular use rather than emergency backup. Multiple frequency bands, encryption capabilities, and antenna arrays that Jack hadn't noticed during daylight hours. When the transmissions began, the voices were professional, clipped, using terminology that sounded current rather than historical. Nighthawk Base, this is Control 7. Status report requested on custodial assets. Jack scrambled to find the radio controls, unsure whether he should respond or simply listen. The voice continued after a pause. Nighthawk Base, Control 7, acknowledge transmission. Protocol requires monthly status confirmation. The realization hit him like cold water. These transmissions weren't historical recordings or random military chatter. Someone was actively monitoring the hangar, expecting regular communication from Samuel, probably unaware that the old engineer had died 3 months ago. Jack found his father's radio log, pages of careful entries documenting monthly calls with various control designations. The most recent entry was dated just weeks before Samuel's death. Control 7 contacted. All assets secure and maintained. No changes in condition or status. He keyed the microphone with trembling hands. Control 7. This is Nighthawk Base. Samuel Landry passed away recently. This is his son, Jack. The silence stretched long enough that Jack wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Then, understood, Nighthawk Base. Stand by for further instructions. The radio went silent, leaving Jack alone with the implications of what had just happened. His father's death had apparently disrupted an ongoing operation that someone considered important enough to monitor regularly. Within hours, Jack suspected there would be visitors, possibly friendly, possibly not. Dr. Rodriguez arrived the next morning with coffee and grim news. "I've been researching Project Nighthawk more thoroughly," she said, settling onto a folding chair Jack had brought for their meetings. "The program was more controversial than I initially realized." She spread photocopied documents across a workbench, pages from congressional hearings and military budget analyses that painted a picture of bureaucratic warfare and political maneuvering. "The aircraft were designed for humanitarian missions, as I told you. But the same technology could be easily adapted for intelligence gathering or covert operations. When certain senators learned about the dual-use potential, they demanded the program be terminated and all assets destroyed. But Dad kept them instead. Your father was caught in the middle of a fight between people who wanted the aircraft preserved for legitimate humanitarian use and others who wanted them eliminated to prevent potential misuse. Someone with significant authority decided that unofficial preservation was preferable to destruction." Jack studied the documents, seeing his father's situation with new clarity. Samuel hadn't been hiding stolen property. He'd been protecting aircraft from political expediency, preserving technology that could save lives if used properly. "What changed?" Jack asked. "Why did they stop the regular contact after Dad died?" "I suspect there are people who've been waiting for this moment, waiting for Samuel to pass away so they could reclaim the aircraft without having to acknowledge the preservation program officially." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed across the empty airfield. Jack looked through the hangar doors to see a convoy of black SUVs parking near the entrance. Men in dark suits emerged, along with a woman carrying a briefcase who walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Dr. Rodriguez," Jack said quietly, "I think we're about to meet some of those people." The woman approached first, extending a hand with professional efficiency. "Mr. Landry, I'm Agent Sarah Morrison, Department of Defense. We need to discuss your father's custodial arrangements." She was younger than Jack had expected, probably in her 40s, with short blonde hair and eyes that evaluated everything they saw. Her handshake was firm, her manner direct but not unfriendly. I wasn't aware my father had custodial arrangements with anyone, Jack said. Mr. Landry, your father was entrusted with assets that belong to the United States government. His death terminates that custodial relationship and requires transfer of those assets to authorized personnel. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward. Agent Morrison, I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez, University Aviation History Department. Are you familiar with the legal documentation surrounding Project Nighthawk's cancellation? Something flickered in Agent Morrison's expression: surprise, recognition, or calculation. Dr. Rodriguez, this is a matter of national security that doesn't require academic consultation. Actually, it does. The aircraft in this hangar represent one of the most significant aviation preservation efforts of the past 50 years. They have immense historical value that transcends their original military applications. Jack watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about recovering government property, this was about competing visions of what the aircraft represented and how they should be used. Agent Morrison, Jack said, I'd like to understand my legal position before discussing any transfers. My father maintained these aircraft for decades, apparently with official sanction. I inherited them along with the property and all associated responsibilities. Mr. Landry, with respect, you don't have the security clearance or technical expertise to maintain classified military assets. Maybe not, but I have the legal ownership papers and 37 years of maintenance records that suggest this arrangement was intended to be permanent. Agent Morrison's professional composure slipped slightly. You have ownership papers? Jack produced the documents he'd found in Samuel's files: title transfers, custodial agreements, and letters that, while heavily redacted, clearly established Samuel's legal rights to the aircraft and property. Your father was supposed to destroy these aircraft in 1987, Agent Morrison said, scanning the papers with obvious frustration. The preservation arrangement was never officially authorized. Then why did someone keep paying for parts and maintenance for 37 years? Wyatt asked, producing the financial records they'd discovered. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Agent Morrison looked at the financial documentation, at Dr. Rodriguez's historical evidence, at Jack's determined expression, and seemed to realize that simple asset recovery wasn't going to be possible. Mr. Landry, these aircraft represent advanced technology that could be dangerous in civilian hands. Regardless of the legal complexities, national security requires proper oversight. Jack felt the weight of his father's trust, the responsibility that Samuel had carried alone for decades. The easy answer would be to hand everything over to the government, walk away with whatever compensation they offered, and return to his simple life of unemployment and family disappointment. But looking at Wyatt's engaged expression, at Dr. Rodriguez's scholarly excitement, at evidence of his father's lifelong dedication to preserving something important, Jack knew he couldn't take the easy path. Agent Morrison, I appreciate your concerns about security, but these aircraft have been safely maintained in civilian hands for nearly 4 decades. I think we need to discuss how that arrangement can continue rather than how to terminate it. Samuel's personal journal revealed a man tormented by conscience and sustained by purpose. Jack found it hidden inside a false bottom of his father's desk, bound in worn leather and filled with handwriting that grew increasingly shaky over the decades, but never lost its careful precision. The early entries, dating from the project's cancellation, revealed Samuel's anguish over orders to destroy aircraft he believed could save lives. Received final directive today. One entry read, all Nighthawk assets to be dismantled and materials disposed of through standard protocols. Cannot bring myself to destroy what we've built. These aircraft could deliver medicine to places no other plane can reach. They could evacuate the wounded from disaster zones. How do I reconcile duty with conscience? Later entries showed how Samuel had negotiated an unofficial preservation arrangement with sympathetic officials who shared his vision of the aircraft's humanitarian potential. The conspiracy, it could be called, that involved career military officers who believed the political cancellation was short-sighted, and aviation engineers who couldn't bear to see advanced technology wasted over bureaucratic concerns. Colonel Martinez understands the dilemma. Samuel had written, "The aircraft will be preserved under civilian custodial care, maintained to operational standards, documented for historical purposes. If political climate changes, or if genuine humanitarian need arises, they can be reactivated quickly." Jack read those words twice, understanding finally why his father had seemed distant during his childhood. Samuel had been carrying a secret that affected national security, international relations, and the lives of people who might someday need the aircraft he was protecting. The weight of that responsibility had shaped every aspect of his life. Wyatt discovered the most revealing entries, while Jack prepared lunch on a camping stove they'd brought to the hangar. His son's voice was quiet when he called his father over. "Dad, listen to this. It's from 15 years ago." Wyatt read carefully. "Jack graduated from technical school today. Wanted to tell him how proud I am, but how do I explain that I've spent his entire life protecting aircraft he can never know about? How do I bridge the distance that secrecy has created between us? He thinks I'm disappointed in him, but the truth is, I'm terrified he'll inherit this burden before he's ready to understand it." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. All those years of feeling inadequate, of sensing his father's disappointment, of struggling to connect with a man who seemed perpetually preoccupied, had all been about this. Samuel's distance hadn't been disapproval, it had been protection. "There's more," Wyatt said gently. "From just last year, Jack's wife died today. Want to comfort my son, but don't know how without explaining why I've been absent from his life. The aircraft have been my responsibility for 35 years, but Jack has always been my priority. When I'm gone, he'll inherit both the burden and the opportunity to choose differently than I did." Jack had to step outside the hangar to compose himself. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and distant rain. He stood looking at the abandoned runways where his father had worked in secret for decades, maintaining aircraft that represented hope for humanitarian missions that might never be authorized. Dr. Rodriguez found him there, having arrived with more historical documentation and a thermos of coffee. "How are you processing all this?" she asked. "I spent 40 years thinking my father was disappointed in me. Turns out he was protecting me from something he wasn't sure I could handle. And now you have to decide whether he was right." They walked back into the hangar together, where Wyatt was photographing pages from the journal with careful attention to detail. Dr. Rodriguez examined the entries with professional interest, occasionally nodding or making notes. "Your father was part of something remarkable," she said. "This journal documents one of the most significant aircraft preservation efforts in aviation history. These aircraft represent technology that was decades ahead of its time, designed for missions that are still relevant today." "What kind of missions?" "Medical evacuation from disaster zones, supply delivery to isolated populations, rapid response to humanitarian crises. The Nighthawks can land on unpaved strips, operate in extreme weather, and cover distances that would require multiple refueling stops for conventional aircraft." Jack thought about recent natural disasters, refugee crises, medical emergencies in remote areas where conventional aid had arrived too late to save lives. The aircraft his father had preserved weren't just historical artifacts, they were tools that could still serve their original humanitarian purpose. "But the government wants them back," Wyatt said. "Some people in the government want them back," Dr. Rodriguez corrected. "Others have been quietly supporting your father's preservation efforts for decades. The radio transmissions you intercepted suggest ongoing official interest in maintaining the aircraft rather than reclaiming them." That afternoon, they received an unexpected visitor. Colonel James Martinez, retired, arrived in a civilian car and civilian clothes, but his bearing and manner left no doubt about his military background. He was a tall man in his 70s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything tactically. "Jack Landry," he said, extending a hand. "I served with your father, been expecting this call for years." You knew Dad was going to leave me the aircraft? Samuel was always clear about his intentions. He believed the Nighthawks should stay with his family people who understood the difference between preserving something important and exploiting it for personal gain. Colonel Martinez walked around the partially uncovered aircraft with the familiarity of someone who'd spent years working with similar technology. His presence seemed to validate everything Jack had learned about his father's hidden life. These aircraft were my responsibility originally, Martinez explained. When the political winds shifted and cancellation became inevitable, we had a choice: destroy irreplaceable technology or find a way to preserve it for future humanitarian use. Samuel volunteered to maintain them indefinitely. Without official authorization? With very careful unofficial authorization, the kind that allows plausible deniability if questions are asked, but ensures the aircraft remain available if they're ever needed for legitimate purposes. Jack felt the complexity of his inheritance deepening. His father hadn't just been hiding aircraft, been part of a network of military and civilian personnel who'd chosen conscience over bureaucracy, preservation over politics. What does Agent Morrison really want? Jack asked. Sarah Morrison represents people who believe these aircraft are too dangerous to remain in civilian hands. They're not wrong about the security concerns, but they're missing the bigger picture about humanitarian applications. And what do you represent? Colonel Martinez smiled for the first time since arriving. I represent people who believe your father made the right choice 37 years ago, and that you're capable of making the right choice now. As evening approached, Jack realized that the comfortable isolation of the past weeks was ending. Word was spreading about the aircraft, bringing attention from multiple directions, some welcome, some potentially dangerous. The time for quiet discovery and family bonding was giving way to decisions that would affect not just his own future, but the legacy his father had died protecting. What would you do? He asked the colonel. What Samuel did. Protect something important until the right moment comes to use it properly. That night, after everyone had gone home, Jack sat alone in the hangar reading his father's journal by lamplight. The entries from Samuel's final year revealed a man at peace with his choices, but concerned about the future. Jack will have to decide what these aircraft mean to him. Samuel had written just months before his death. I've given him the tools and the truth. Now he must choose whether to carry the burden forward or find a better path that I couldn't see. The burden was real, Jack realized. But so was the opportunity, the chance to honor his father's sacrifice while creating something that could serve people who needed help in a world that still generated plenty of humanitarian crises. For the first time since inheriting the hangar, Jack began to envision a future that went beyond simply maintaining his father's secret. Agent Morrison's briefcase contained surveillance equipment that had been monitoring the hangar for months, recording every conversation, documenting every visitor, building a comprehensive file on Jack's activities since inheriting the property. But that wasn't the shocking revelation that changed everything Jack thought he understood about his situation. The real twist came when Morrison opened her laptop and showed him satellite footage of the hangar taken just 2 weeks after Samuel's funeral. We've been watching this facility continuously, she said, her tone more apologetic than threatening. Your father's death triggered automatic surveillance protocols that we couldn't shut down without raising questions we weren't prepared to answer. Jack studied the high-resolution images, showing himself and Wyatt exploring the hangar, Dr. Rodriguez examining the aircraft, Colonel Martinez's visit. The level of detail was unsettling. They could read license plates, identify faces, probably lip-read conversations. So you know everything we've discovered. We know more than that, Mr. Landry. We know your father legally owns these aircraft, and we know you've inherited that legal ownership along with all associated rights and responsibilities. Wyatt looked up sharply. What do you mean, legally owns? I thought the government was trying to reclaim them. Agent Morrison closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. That's what my superiors believed until we examined the original documentation. Your grandfather didn't preserve stolen government property. He purchased these aircraft through legitimate defense contractor channels when the military decided to sell rather than destroy them. The hangar seemed to spin around Jack as the implications sank in. Dad bought them? In 1987, the Defense Department faced a choice: spend millions destroying advanced prototypes or recoup some investment by selling them to qualified buyers under strict conditions. Your father, with his security clearance and technical expertise, was the ideal purchaser. Agent Morrison produced a thick folder from her briefcase, revealing documents that told a completely different story than the one Jack had constructed from fragments and assumptions. The sale was legal, fully documented, and included specific provisions for ongoing maintenance and potential government repurchase under certain circumstances. Your father paid $3.2 million for both aircraft and committed to maintaining them in operational condition indefinitely. $3 million? Jack's voice was barely a whisper. Where did Dad get $3 million? That's where it gets interesting. The purchase was financed through a trust fund established by military personnel and defense contractors who believed the aircraft should be preserved for future humanitarian use. Your father served as custodian, but the aircraft were owned collectively by people who shared his vision. Dr. Rodriguez was studying the documentation with obvious excitement. This is unprecedented. A civilian preservation trust for classified military prototypes. The aircraft are worth considerably more now, Agent Morrison continued. Conservative estimates place their value at $90 million, but recent appraisals suggest they could bring $111 million at auction due to their historical significance and advanced technology. Jack felt dizzy. $111 million? But here's the crucial part, Morrison said, producing another set of documents. The trust agreement includes provisions for the aircraft to be donated to approved museums or educational institutions, with the trust members receiving tax benefits rather than direct payment. Your father's will activates those provisions and designates you as the sole decision-maker regarding the aircraft's future. So I could sell them? You could, but the trust agreement strongly encourages donation for educational or humanitarian purposes, and the tax implications of a sale would be significant. Wyatt was reading over the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement. Dad, these papers say you have complete control over $100 million worth of aircraft, and Grandpa set it up so that donating them would actually be more profitable than selling them. The brilliant simplicity of Samuel's plan was starting to become clear. He'd spent decades maintaining aircraft that could never officially exist, funded by people who believed in their humanitarian potential, positioned so that his son would inherit not just valuable assets but a meaningful choice about how to use them. There's one more thing, Agent Morrison said, almost reluctantly. The surveillance we've been conducting wasn't just for security purposes. We've been documenting your character, your decision-making process, your relationship with your son. The trust agreement requires that before the final transfer of ownership, an assessment be made of your suitability as a guardian of these assets. You've been testing me? Your father requested it. He wanted to ensure that his son would approach this responsibility with the same integrity he'd shown for 37 years. Jack looked around the hangar at the aircraft his father had preserved, at the workshop where Samuel had labored in secret, at the evidence of a life spent protecting something larger than personal interest. And what's your assessment? Agent Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. You passed, Mr. Landry. The recommendation will be that you're fully qualified to inherit both the legal ownership and the moral responsibility your father carried. But that's not the end of it, she continued. There are other parties interested in these aircraft. A private military contractor has filed legal claims, arguing that the original sale was invalid and that they have salvage rights to abandoned government property. Media attention is starting to focus on the story. You're about to become the center of a very public dispute over very valuable assets. Jack felt the ground shifting beneath him again. He'd gone from inheriting worthless property to discovering priceless aircraft, to learning he legally owned them, to facing legal challenges from multiple directions. What kind of legal challenges? Northrop Industries claims they have contracts to recover and dispose of cancelled military projects. They're arguing that your father's purchase was unauthorized and that the aircraft should be transferred to them for proper disposal. Disposal? Dr. Rodriguez's voice was sharp. These aircraft are irreplaceable historical artifacts. Northrop isn't interested in historical preservation. They want to reverse engineer the technology for new military contracts. They're offering significant money to anyone who can help them gain legal access to the aircraft. The threat was clear. Jack wasn't just inheriting valuable property, he was inheriting a fight over technology that powerful interests wanted to control for purposes that had nothing to do with his father's humanitarian vision. "What do you recommend I do?" Agent Morrison packed her documents carefully before answering. "Fight them. Your father spent 37 years protecting these aircraft from exactly this kind of exploitation. The legal documentation supports your ownership. The trust agreement provides financial advantages for proper donation, and public opinion will favor preservation over corporate acquisition. But I'd be fighting the government and a major defense contractor. You'd be fighting some people in the government and one defense contractor. But you'd also have support from people who've been waiting decades for the right moment to see these aircraft serve their intended purpose." After Morrison left, Jack sat in the gathering darkness of the hangar, surrounded by his father's life work, and faced with a decision that would define his own legacy. The comfortable fantasy of simple ownership was gone, replaced by the reality of competing claims and public scrutiny. But the journal entries had shown him something important about his father's character. Samuel Landry had never chosen the easy path when principle was at stake. He'd spent 37 years proving that ordinary people could be trusted with extraordinary responsibilities. Now it was Jack's turn to prove he was worthy of that trust. The complete aircraft technical specifications revealed technology so advanced that Dr. Rodriguez called it 30 years ahead of its time, even today. Jack spread the blueprints across multiple tables in the hangar, weighted down with tools to prevent them from curling, creating a technical library that documented every system, every capability, every innovation that made the Nighthawks extraordinary. The specifications revealed aircraft designed with revolutionary efficiency. Advanced composite materials provided strength at half the weight of conventional designs. Hybrid propulsion systems combined jet engines with electric motors for silent operation during critical mission phases. Navigation systems included GPS integration that had been experimental when most aircraft still relied on radio beacons. Most impressive were the humanitarian mission modifications Samuel had continued developing over the decades. Medical bay conversions that could transform the aircraft into flying ambulances. Cargo configurations optimized for disaster relief supplies. Communication systems that could establish emergency networks in areas where infrastructure had failed. "Look at this fuel efficiency data," Dr. Rodriguez said, pointing to performance charts. "These aircraft can reach anywhere in the world with a single refueling stop, carrying payloads that would require multiple flights for conventional aircraft." Jack traced the engineering drawings with newfound appreciation for his father's expertise. Samuel hadn't just maintained these aircraft, he'd improved them, adapting systems for mission profiles that went far beyond their original specifications. The legal preparation had been intense. Jack's attorney, recommended by Colonel Martinez, was a woman named Patricia Vance, who specialized in government contracts and military asset disputes. She'd spent 2 weeks examining every document, every contract, every piece of correspondence that established Jack's legal position. "Your father was exceptionally thorough," she'd told Jack during their final preparation meeting. "The documentation is bulletproof. You own these aircraft free and clear, with no restrictions beyond the moral obligations outlined in the trust agreement." "What about Northrop's claims?" "Legally baseless. They're hoping to pressure you into a settlement by making the litigation expensive and public, but the facts are on your side." The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday in federal court, with Judge Patricia Hamilton presiding. Hamilton had a reputation for fairness and thoroughness, but also for impatience with cases that wasted her time. Jack would have one opportunity to present his case clearly and convincingly. Meanwhile, public attention was building in ways that surprised everyone involved. Local news had picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle between a working-class father and corporate interests trying to claim his inheritance. Aviation enthusiasts from around the country were following developments online, many expressing support for preserving the aircraft as historical artifacts rather than allowing them to disappear into corporate research programs. Wyatt had become unexpectedly central to the media strategy, his genuine enthusiasm for the aircraft's history and humanitarian potential, providing compelling soundbites for news reports. Watching his son speak passionately about his grandfather's legacy and the importance of preserving technology for humanitarian use, Jack felt pride that had nothing to do with money or legal victories. "The thing people don't understand," Wyatt told a reporter, "is that my grandfather wasn't hoarding these aircraft. He was protecting them. There's a difference between keeping something for yourself and keeping something safe for when it's needed." Margaret had surprised Jack by becoming one of his strongest supporters. After seeing the aircraft and understanding their historical significance, she'd organized family members to attend the hearing and had even contacted aviation museums to discuss potential partnership arrangements. "I'm sorry I called Dad's hangar worthless," she'd said during a family dinner the weekend before the hearing. "I should have trusted that he wouldn't waste his life on something meaningless." The family unity felt fragile but genuine, built on shared recognition that Samuel's secret had been worth keeping and was now worth protecting. Dr. Rodriguez had assembled an impressive collection of expert witnesses, aviation, historians, humanitarian aid specialists, and former military personnel who could testify to the aircraft's unique capabilities and historical importance. She'd also prepared extensive documentation showing how the Nighthawks could be integrated into existing disaster relief operations if properly maintained and operated. "The key argument," she'd explained to Jack, "is that these aircraft represent irreplaceable technology that could save lives if used for their intended humanitarian purposes. North Corp wants to study them for military applications, but you're proposing to preserve them for civilian humanitarian use." Colonel Martinez had been working behind the scenes to ensure that the right military personnel would be available to testify about the aircraft's original mission parameters and the legitimacy of Samuel's custodial arrangement. His connections within the defense establishment had produced a surprising level of support for Jack's position. "More people knew about your father's work than he realized," Martinez had told Jack. "The humanitarian applications were always the real priority for those of us who supported the preservation program." The night before the hearing, Jack walked through the hangar one final time, checking systems his father had maintained and thinking about the responsibility he was about to accept publicly. Tomorrow's hearing would determine whether he could continue Samuel's work or whether the aircraft would disappear into corporate research programs that had no interest in their humanitarian potential. But the decision felt clear now, looking at the sleek aircraft that represented his father's life work, at the workshop where Samuel had labored in secret for decades, at the documentation proving that preservation had always been about serving others rather than personal gain. Jack knew what choice his father would have wanted him to make. The aircraft were worth a fortune, but their value transcended money. They represented hope for people in crisis, technology that could reach places other aircraft couldn't go, capabilities that could save lives in situations where conventional help arrived too late. Samuel Landry had spent 37 years protecting that potential. Jack intended to spend whatever years he had left fulfilling it. His phone buzzed with a text from Wyatt. "Dad, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of what you're doing. Grandpa would be too." Jack smiled, pocketing the phone and turning off the hangar lights. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Tomorrow would determine whether he could continue his father's mission or whether the aircraft would be lost to interests that had no connection to their humanitarian purpose. But tonight, in the quiet hangar where Samuel had worked alone for so many years, Jack felt the presence of his father's approval and his son's pride. Whatever the court decided, the Landry family had finally found its way back to the values that mattered: integrity, service, and the courage to protect something important even when no one was watching. Samuel's final letter emerged from its hiding place in the aircraft cockpit, like a message from beyond the grave, discovered only when Jack decided to clean the interior compartments the morning of the federal hearing. Hidden behind an access panel that required specific tools to open, the envelope was marked, "For Jack when the time comes," in his father's unmistakable handwriting. Jack's hands trembled as he opened it, aware that Patricia Vance was checking her watch and the courthouse was expecting them in 2 hours. "My dear son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the moment I've been preparing for has finally arrived. You now face the choice I've been carrying for 37 years, whether to preserve something important or surrender it to forces that would use it for purposes far removed from its intended mission." The letter continued with explanations that filled gaps Jack hadn't even known existed. Samuel described the aircraft's original design: mission rapid delivery of medical aid to disaster zones, evacuation of wounded personnel from hostile areas, supply runs to isolated populations that conventional aircraft couldn't reach safely. These aircraft could have saved thousands of lives during natural disasters, refugee crises, and humanitarian emergencies, Samuel had written. But political concerns about their potential military applications led to cancellation before they could prove their value for peaceful purposes. The letter revealed that Samuel's purchase of the aircraft had been coordinated with a network of military officers, defense contractors, and humanitarian organizations who believed the technology was too valuable to destroy. The financing had come from people willing to invest their own money to preserve capabilities that governments were too politically cautious to maintain officially. "I've spent your entire life protecting these aircraft because I believed someday the political climate would change enough to allow their humanitarian use. I couldn't involve you in this secret because the burden of keeping it would have shaped your life as it shaped mine. But now the choice is yours." Jack read the final paragraph twice, his throat tight with emotion. "Son, I've watched you struggle with feeling like you've never measured up to some standard I set. The truth is, you've always exceeded every standard that mattered to me. Your kindness, your integrity, your love for your family, these are the qualities that qualify you to inherit this responsibility. Choose based on what will help the most people, not what will make the most money. Choose based on the man you are, not the man you think I wanted you to be." The letter was signed simply Dad, followed by a postscript: "I've arranged for the aircraft to be displayed publicly, if that's the path you choose. All necessary documentation is in the red folder behind my desk. I'm proud of you no matter what you decide." Jack found the red folder exactly where the letter indicated, filled with detailed plans for converting the hangar into a public aviation museum and humanitarian mission training center. Samuel had spent years developing proposals, architectural drawings, and financial projections for transforming his secret preservation project into an educational facility that could serve the public while maintaining the aircraft's humanitarian mission capability. "He thought of everything," Wyatt said, reading over the museum plans. "Look at this: visitor centers, educational programs, training facilities for disaster relief personnel. He wanted these aircraft to teach people about humanitarian aviation." The federal courthouse was imposing, all marble columns and formal procedures that made Jack feel underdressed despite his best suit. Judge Hamilton was a stern woman in her 60s who listened to opening arguments with the focused attention of someone accustomed to cutting through legal complexity to reach essential facts. North Corp's attorney, a polished man named Davidson, argued that Samuel's purchase had been irregular, that classified military technology shouldn't remain in civilian hands, and that national security required transfer of the aircraft to qualified corporate custodians who could ensure proper handling. "These are not museum pieces," Davidson insisted. They are advanced military assets with technology that could be dangerous if misunderstood or mishandled by unqualified personnel. Patricia Vance countered with documentation proving the legitimacy of Samuel's ownership and the ongoing support he'd received from military and civilian authorities. She emphasized the aircraft's humanitarian design mission and the trust agreement's provisions for educational use. Mr. Landry inherited not just aircraft, but a 37-year commitment to preserving technology for peaceful purposes. His father's careful stewardship proves that civilian custodianship can be both secure and beneficial. Judge Hamilton examined Samuel's letter and the museum plans with obvious interest. Mr. Landry, this documentation suggests your father intended these aircraft for public educational display. Is that your intention as well? Jack stood, feeling the weight of his father's trust and his son's expectations. Your Honor, my father spent 37 years protecting aircraft that were designed to save lives. I intend to honor that commitment by ensuring they remain available for their original humanitarian mission, while serving as educational resources about the intersection of advanced technology and humanitarian service. The words felt right as he spoke them, capturing both Samuel's vision and Jack's own growing understanding of what the aircraft represented. The public petition arrived like an avalanche of support that no one had expected. While lawyers argued legal technicalities, the community had been organizing itself around a simple principle: the aircraft belonged in public hands, serving educational and humanitarian purposes rather than corporate profit. Dr. Rodriguez read the petition summary to a packed courtroom. 17,000 signatures from aviation enthusiasts, educators, veterans, and community members supporting the establishment of the Samuel Landry Aviation Heritage Center. Endorsements from 12 major museums, 6 humanitarian organizations, and the veterans of foreign wars. Judge Hamilton listened as witnesses testified about the aircraft's historical significance and humanitarian potential. Colonel Martinez, wearing his dress uniform for the occasion, spoke about the original mission parameters and the network of military personnel who had supported Samuel's preservation efforts. These aircraft represent the best of military innovation technology designed to serve humanity rather than destroy it, Martinez testified. Sergeant Landry understood that distinction and spent his life protecting it. But it was Wyatt's testimony that seemed to move the judge most profoundly. Jack watched his son speak with a maturity and passion that transformed the sullen teenager into a young man with purpose and conviction. Your Honor, my grandfather died without ever telling us about the most important work of his life because he was protecting something larger than his own recognition. He taught me that real strength isn't about keeping things for yourself, it's about taking care of things that matter to other people. Wyatt paused, looking directly at the judge. These aircraft were designed to help people in crisis. My grandfather kept them safe for 37 years so they could serve that purpose someday. My father wants to honor that mission by making sure the aircraft remain available for humanitarian use while teaching people about the history of aviation and service. The courtroom was silent as Wyatt continued. North Corp wants to take them apart to build new weapons. We want to preserve them so they can continue serving the mission they were always meant for. I think my grandfather would want people to learn from his example of putting service above profit. Judge Hamilton's questions focused on practical concerns about security, maintenance, and public access. Jack answered honestly about his plans to work with Dr. Rodriguez and Colonel Martinez to establish proper oversight, maintain the aircraft to operational standards, and ensure that public access didn't compromise security or historical preservation. The aircraft will remain capable of serving humanitarian missions if proper authorization is ever granted, Jack explained. But they'll also educate visitors about the history of advanced aviation technology and the people who dedicated their lives to developing it for peaceful purposes. North Corp's attorney made a final argument based on national security concerns and the complexity of maintaining classified technology in civilian facilities. But when Judge Hamilton asked for specific examples of security risks, Davidson's responses seemed theoretical rather than factual. The aircraft have been safely maintained in civilian custody for nearly 4 decades, Patricia Vance pointed out. Mr. Landry's proposal includes enhanced security measures, professional oversight, and continued cooperation with appropriate government agencies. The judge's deliberation lasted 3 hours. Jack spent the time in the courthouse cafeteria with Wyatt, Dr. Rodriguez, and a growing crowd of supporters who'd driven from around the state to attend the hearing. Veterans who'd served with Samuel shared stories about his character and expertise. Aviation enthusiasts discussed the aircraft's technical innovations and historical significance. Margaret arrived with other family members, having organized carpools and taken time off work to show support. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what Dad was doing," she told Jack. "But I understand now why this matters." When Judge Hamilton returned to the courtroom, her expression was serious, but not grim. She spoke directly to Jack as she delivered her ruling. "Mr. Landry, the court finds that your father's ownership of these aircraft was legitimate, properly documented, and conducted with appropriate government oversight. The trust agreement provisions are binding and clearly favor educational and humanitarian use over commercial exploitation." Relief flooded through Jack, followed immediately by the recognition that victory brought its own enormous responsibilities. "However," the judge continued, "this ruling comes with specific conditions. The aircraft must be maintained to museum standards with appropriate security measures. Public access must be managed through qualified educational programs. Any future operational use must be approved through proper military or humanitarian channels. North Corp's claims are dismissed as legally insufficient. The aircraft and all associated materials remain the property of Jack Landry, to be administered according to the trust agreement provisions and his father's documented intentions." The courtroom erupted in applause from supporters, while North Corp's legal team packed their materials with obvious frustration. Davidson approached Jack as people celebrated around them. "This isn't over, Landry. Those aircraft are worth too much to remain in amateur hands indefinitely." But Colonel Martinez was already moving to intercept the threat, his presence reminding everyone that Jack's support network included people with both legal authority and personal commitment to protecting Samuel's legacy. "Actually, Mr. Davidson, it is over. The court has ruled, the documentation is clear, and the aircraft are exactly where they belong, in the hands of people who understand their true value." As they left the courthouse, Jack felt the weight of victory and responsibility in equal measure. He'd won the legal right to continue his father's work, but now he had to prove himself worthy of the trust Samuel had placed in him 37 years earlier. The Samuel Landry Aviation Heritage Center opened its doors 6 months after the court ruling, transforming the secret hangar into a beacon of education and remembrance that honored both his father's service and the aircraft he'd protected for nearly 4 decades. Jack stood before the entrance on opening day, wearing the museum director's badge that still felt surreal, watching families and aviation enthusiasts stream through doors that had been sealed in secrecy for so long. The official charter document, framed and mounted just inside the entrance, represented the culmination of months of planning, fundraising, and careful preparation. The transformation had been remarkable. Professional exhibit designers had created displays that told the story of Project Nighthawk while respecting its classified origins, focusing on the humanitarian mission parameters and the dedication of personnel who'd believed in technology's potential to serve humanity. Interactive stations allowed visitors to explore aircraft systems, learn about disaster relief operations, and understand the engineering innovations that made humanitarian aviation possible. The aircraft themselves remained the centerpiece, positioned to allow close examination while preserving their operational integrity. Detailed placards explained their capabilities, their history, and their continued readiness for humanitarian missions should proper authorization ever be granted. Wyatt had become the museum's most effective guide, his genuine enthusiasm and deep knowledge of the aircraft's history making him popular with visitors of all ages. Jack watched his son explain the fuel efficiency systems to a group of engineering students, speaking with confidence and expertise that would have made Samuel proud. The hybrid propulsion system allows these aircraft to operate silently during critical mission phases, Wyatt was saying. Imagine being able to deliver medical supplies to a disaster zone without alerting hostile forces to the operation, or evacuating wounded personnel without compromising their location. Dr. Rodriguez served as chief curator, ensuring historical accuracy while developing educational programs that connected the aircraft's story to broader themes of innovation, service, and moral courage. Her expertise had been crucial in establishing the museum's credibility with both academic institutions and government agencies. What Samuel Landry accomplished, she told visitors during the opening ceremony, was the preservation of irreplaceable technology through personal sacrifice and unwavering commitment. This museum honors not just aircraft, but the principle that some things are too important to be lost to political expediency. Margaret had surprised everyone by accepting a position on the museum's board of directors, bringing business skills and community connections that proved invaluable in establishing the center as a respected cultural institution. Her transformation from skeptic to advocate represented the broader family healing that the aircraft had somehow facilitated. "I spent years not understanding what our father was doing," she told a reporter. "Now I see that he was teaching us about responsibility, commitment, and the courage to protect things that matter, even when no one else understands their importance." Colonel Martinez visited regularly, often bringing other veterans who'd served with Samuel or worked on similar projects. Their stories added layers to the museum's narrative, connecting the aircraft to the broader history of military personnel who'd chosen service over recognition, mission accomplishment over career advancement. The humanitarian applications had proven more relevant than anyone anticipated. Within months of opening, the museum was hosting training programs for disaster relief organizations, using the aircraft's capabilities to teach rescue coordinators about rapid deployment options and remote area access techniques. Representatives from the International Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, and United Nations humanitarian agencies visited to assess whether the aircraft could be activated for actual emergency operations under proper international oversight. The conversations were preliminary but promising, suggesting that Samuel's vision of humanitarian service might eventually be realized. On quiet evenings when the museum was closed, Jack often found himself alone in the hangar, reading his father's journal and thinking about the choices that had led to this moment. The aircraft hummed quietly under their maintenance lighting, systems powered and ready, as Samuel had kept them for decades. The radio still received transmissions from Control 7, but now the conversations were open and supportive. The monitoring network that had overseen Samuel's work had evolved into a consultation resource for the museum, providing technical expertise and government liaison services that ensured continued compliance with security requirements. "Your father would be amazed by what you've accomplished," Agent Morrison had told Jack during a recent visit. "He always hoped the aircraft would eventually serve their intended purpose, but I don't think he imagined they'd become educational resources that inspire the next generation of humanitarian aviation specialists." The museum's success had also provided unexpected personal rewards. Jack's work as director utilized skills he'd never known. He possessed administration, education, public speaking, and project management that drew on his mechanical background while expanding into areas his father would have recognized as leadership. The relationship with Wyatt had been transformed completely. Working together to establish the museum, learning about Samuel's legacy, and sharing responsibility for preserving something important had created bonds that Jack had never expected to develop with his teenage son. "Dad," Wyatt said one evening as they secured the hangar for the night, "I think I want to study aviation engineering, not just as a career, but to understand what Grandpa was protecting and maybe continue improving it." Jack felt the continuity of purpose, that Samuel had probably hoped for knowledge and commitment passing to the next generation, ensuring that the aircraft's humanitarian potential would be understood and eventually realized by people who shared the vision that had sustained their family through decades of secrecy. The museum attracted visitors from around the world, aviation professionals who came to study the aircraft's advanced systems, historians researching Cold War technology programs, and families who simply wanted to learn about the intersection of innovation and service. But Jack's favorite visitors were the local school groups, children who listened wide-eyed to stories about aircraft designed to help people in crisis, who asked questions about how technology could be used to make the world better, who saw the aircraft not as weapons or museum pieces, but as tools for serving others. Standing before the hangar, where his father had worked in secret for so many years, watching the aircraft serve their intended purpose of inspiring and educating, Jack finally understood what Samuel had been trying to teach him all along. Success wasn't measured by recognition or profit, but by the quiet satisfaction of protecting something important until the right moment came to share it with the world. Legacy wasn't about personal achievement, but about creating something that would continue serving others long after the creators were gone. Samuel Landry had given his son more than aircraft or property. He'd given him the opportunity to choose service over self-interest, legacy over immediate gratification, and the chance to honor the best aspects of his father's character while creating his own path forward. As Jack locked the museum doors and headed home to Wyatt, he carried with him the profound satisfaction of work that mattered, family relationships rebuilt, and a future that honored the past while serving the present. The aircraft his father had protected would continue their mission of inspiring service, teaching innovation, and proving that ordinary people could be trusted with extraordinary responsibilities. The hangar that had once housed secrets now housed hope, and the man who'd inherited his father's burden had transformed it into his own legacy of service and education.